There's a myth going round town that when you get older you just sit down and start rocking. Just rocking. In a way that's true, if you know what I mean. Just take a look at the senior scene. Well, it's rocking.
And now Susan will discuss the legal and ethical issues regarding VSED.
When a person like my mom begins to consider ways of hastening her death to avoid suffering, she may have 3 or 4 legal options. 1, physician-assisted suicide, or as some refer to it, aid in dying, where it is legally available through a lethal prescription, which at this point is Washington, Oregon, Vermont, California, Colorado, Montana, the District of Columbia, and most recently Maine. Secondly, the administration of large doses of opioids or sedatives in the case of intractable pain or anxiety in order to treat the pain or anxiety, but which may have the double effect of leading to unconsciousness and hastening death. Third, patient refusal of treatment if one is dependent on life-sustaining medical treatment, such as a ventilator or artificial hydration or nutrition. And fourth is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. Now, depending on the circumstances or where a person resides, she may very well be advised by her physician about the first 3 choices, but probably will not be informed about the 4th choice, VSED. This is possibly because of lack of knowledge or misperceptions on the part of the medical community of the biological facts underlying VSED. It's also possibly because of uncertainty in the medical community about the legality of VSED, or possibly because of uncertainty in the medical community about the ethics of VSED. Today, we hope to address all of these concerns. We were unable to find any empirical studies evaluating awareness or knowledge about VSED as an option at the end of life among healthcare providers or the general public. Our anecdotal experience has indicated that both patients and providers are often unaware of this option, or that there are many misperceptions about it. In our personal experience, surprisingly, even hospice nurses displayed a complete lack of knowledge of the practicalities of VSED and seemed, frankly, a little freaked out by my mother's decision. However, in the 9 years since my mother's death, it appears that hospice organizations are beginning to recognize this as an area that has not been adequately understood and considered, but it still remains to be seen the extent to which hospice actively supports this option. Now I'd like to do a legal analysis. I would like to briefly go through the legality of VSED. VSED is legal in all 50 states. But by that I mean that there is not one court case or piece of legislation making it illegal. But in most jurisdictions, there's just no law at all to address VSED. And this has led to legal uncertainties on behalf of medical professionals and caregivers. These perceived legal uncertainties may lead healthcare providers to undermine a patient's decision to stop eating and drinking, or even more likely, not to even inform an appropriate patient that the option exists. The few relevant cases that do exist in the U.S. case law support a patient's right to self-determination in choosing VSED by analogizing it to the well-established right to refuse medical treatment, or even categorizing VSED as a direct exercise of a patient's right to refuse medical treatment. And courts have consistently held that any kind of forced feeding would be a legal battery and therefore impermissible. But what about the concern that VSED is suicide and that a physician might be risking criminal or civil liability for assisted suicide in informing a patient about VSED or supporting a patient who chooses VSED? Well, first of all, suicide is not a crime in any U.S. state. But more importantly, VSED is not suicide. The human body naturally loses fluids, and choosing VSED is simply electing not to interfere with this dehydration process. Assisted suicide is a crime in most states, but if VSED is not suicide, then informing a patient about VSED or supporting a patient that has chosen VSED is not assisted suicide. Moreover, all states which do recognize the crime of assisted suicide require an active step, such as providing a toxic agent, as compared to a passive act or omission. Neither honoring a patient's decision to refuse nourishment nor providing information about VSED would be the kind of active steps envisioned by these assisted suicide statutes. This analysis demonstrates that there is no legal basis for a healthcare provider to withhold information about VSED from patients because there is no reasonable fear of legal liability on the part of a healthcare provider. What if a physician is morally opposed to VSED? A physician is not required to affirmatively assist a patient who has chosen an option to which the physician has a moral objection. But a physician is ethically required to honor a patient's refusal to receive any treatment, including force feeding. Therefore, such a physician is ethically obligated to refer such a patient to another physician. The ethical analysis is similar to abortion, in which a physician is ethically required to inform a patient about the option of abortion, but is not ethically required to perform the procedure if he or she has moral objections. Such a physician is, however, ethically required to make an appropriate referral for such a patient or be ethically guilty of abandoning the patient. In summary, healthcare providers' concerns about the legality or ethics of VSED are misplaced. They not only may, but they should honor patient requests about VSED. And furthermore, they should educate patients about this option. Now, before we entertain questions, I would like to mention, and you may have seen that we have some handouts. And those include a bibliography of several of the sources that we used to prepare this talk. One of the sources listed is a website called The Conversation Project, which you might be familiar with. And it's led by the author, Ellen Goodman. It provides a wealth of articles, and an increasing wealth of articles, templates and guidelines for end-of-life decisions, including guidelines for end-of-life decisions such as having discussions with one's family well in advance of death. We highly recommend this website. We also have a fact sheet on VSED, which was provided to us by Compassion and Choices. Any questions? The question is, at what point would someone choose to start VSED?
So there's no real, date or time. A person who is thinking about doing it should be thinking about it, should talk to family, friends, clergy, sort of come to an understanding about why they're doing it, and make sure that the support is in place so that any kind of complications or, situations can be taken care but it's really just a matter of stopping eating and drinking.
The question is about someone with dementia and whether the medical, if this choice is covered in a medical power of attorney, whether that would be adequate to allow VSED to proceed. This is the million-dollar question that
That's a legal question.
This is the million-dollar question that we almost always get, because this is the fear that most of us have. And we don't have an answer. We have some speculation. There are people that are working on this question, lawyers and health professionals, particularly that I am in contact with in New York, are working on language for advanced directives that they hope would be most effective in achieving this outcome, but there is no certainty that it would work. The issue is competency, and the issue is when the competency has to exist. Is it when you're creating the advanced directive and when you are initiating the process? And it's unclear. The question is, how long does it take a person to become bedridden in the case of VSED? I can speak to my mother's situation, but the variable is how strong they were at the time they begin the fasting process. My mother was she hadn't really been eating much. She had been her mouth was so destroyed by the radiation that she could only take Ensure, and she wasn't very crazy about that. At the same time, she was up and about and walking around, and I would say she only became bedridden the last few days. She would get up and go to the bathroom herself for the first maybe 8 days of the 12 days that she lived. And then the last few days she used a bedside commode with the help of the aide that we hired. And then the last day she was in bed. But she was, the one thing I regret is on the day before she lost consciousness, she got a little bit fuzzy. And she was trying to tell me about something, and she said to me, "I know I'm not making any sense." And I said, "Oh, yes, you are, Mom." And I kind of regret that I said that, because she, in her own way, was very aware of her own state. And I was kind of denying that, and I think it would have been healthier to go along with it. But she was really sharp until the last couple of days and able to get up. She didn't have a lot of energy, so she wasn't getting up a lot, but she was energetic until pretty close to the end.
Yeah, one of the things that we learned taking care of Susan's mother was that we were initially really trying to protect her, from too much stimulation or too many visitors or too much excitement, but it turns out that she was totally able and wanted to really control her own life. So she would be asleep, and it would be our inclination not to bother her because she's asleep. But if someone came to the door to visit, we would wake her and say, "Someone's here, do you want to talk?" And she would say, "Oh, of course." Wake up and talk, and then go back to sleep. So you have to really pay attention to the person.
And it was a very peaceful time. In the household, it was very different than you would expect it to be. The question was about how you control nausea or vomiting that might result as a result of the ketosis that occurs.
So I don't think, we haven't seen it, and I haven't read about that happening. people are not, the ketoacidosis maybe in diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes, I think has other comorbidities which might, can cause nauseousness. But I haven't seen it reported, and in the people that we've worked with, it's not been an issue at all.
So the question is, if someone is on medication, do they continue the medication?
So the answer to that is, at this point, you would be treating, in basically an attempt for comfort. So you wouldn't be treating to keep a heart beating, but you would certainly treat pain. So it would be a palliative kind of approach, just to make sure that people were comfortable, and if the medicines were useful in continuing with comfort, then they would be continued. But otherwise, there's no reason to continue medicine.
The question is that the questioner has read that sometimes with VSED, hallucinations may occur, and wondered if that would be treated.
So if there were truly disturbing hallucinations, they could certainly be treated just like any kind of anxiety or, hallucinations that could occur otherwise. There are things that occur during the dying process, in any kind of dying process, not necessarily related to VSED, that people, when they're dying and getting close to death, can exhibit shaking or arm movement or breathing changes. I mean, these things are all a normal part of dying, and mostly are just supported, but not caused by VSED.
Yeah, listen, if the person had been receiving feeding through a peg and then lost competency, would it be okay to remove the peg? That situation is not the same as dementia. That situation is much like the person who says, or it is the person who is saying, if I lose consciousness, I do not want to continue artificial nutrition and hydration. And that is definitely enforceable through an advance directive. So that's not a problem. Or else I'm missing something in your question.
That's correct. I mean, basically a decision to withhold or terminate active medical care and treatment is within the realm and the rights of the person with the power of medical attorney.
Yeah.
Just like stopping, a person making a decision to stop the respirator for a family member.
Sure. The questioner says she is emotionally conflicted between the options of taking an overdose or stopping eating, which she would assume would be immediate or quick, or stopping eating and drinking, which would last over a period of a few weeks.
So, of course, that's totally a personal question and not really answerable. Well,
what?
So I was going to. All I can do is speak from my own, experience, and the taking medicine is obvious. You just go to sleep and die. Family can be present. I mean, there's still support available. The things that we like about voluntary stopping and eating and drinking is that it really is a natural, gentle, progressive process, which is not painful, and you become aware and are much more able to participate in the process.
The things that I've read about taking, as you said, an overdose, if you're talking about aid in dying, the dosages have been calibrated and prescribed by physicians in order to be effective. The problem with voluntarily taking an overdose in a state where aid in dying is not legal is that sometimes it doesn't work, and that sometimes people are left in a worse state than if they had not made that choice. So I think that's the main problem with that choice.
That's true.
I also think there might be some some legal risk of family being with you if you made that choice in a state where it's not legal. But I'm not 100% positive about that.
It's a much more complicated
Legal and medical?
design, is that people have gone through great lengths to set up a procedure so that a person is able to carry out the end of life, take their medicine without other people being present or, being implicated. So that is an important consideration that has to, occur in North Carolina.
One of the things that bother me, I'm sure many of you remember the story of the young woman who had, I think she had cancer, brain cancer. It was a couple of years ago, I forget her name. Brittany Maynard. And she moved from her home in California to Oregon, which had medical aid in dying. And she moved her whole family. And you have to establish residency in order to afford yourself with medical aid and dying. And during that whole time period, Compassion and Choices was very much publicizing her dilemma. And I felt like screaming, all you have to do is stop eating and drinking, and you didn't have to move your whole family from California. It just seemed, Compassion and Choices supports VSED, but to a certain extent, they've very much reduced their discussions about it. And to a certain extent, the availability of VSED weakens the argument of the need for medical aid in dying. Not that I don't think that people should have as many choices as possible, but I thought in the case of Brittany Maynard that having to bring your whole family to another state for 6 months was a lot to go through. Yes, that's an interesting, the point has been made that in hospice practice, or in any death, it is quite common to lose thirst and hunger towards the end of the dying process, and that hospice supports allowing that to happen and not forcing patients to eat and drink. And I'll allow you to address the issue of that natural.
Well, what I was
occurrence.
thinking of is kind of a corollary, is that often when a family member, gets really ill and sort of stops eating or is not eating as much, there's associated guilt in the family, that I need to feed my mother. I need to do that because that's going to make her more comfortable and keep her alive. But it's very clear that this natural stopping of eating and drinking, and in fact stopping of eating, drinking at all, is not uncomfortable. And so when someone is ill and stops eating and drinking, that does not cause distress. And so, you can support that and not have to worry that the person is uncomfortable.
Yeah, it often becomes a point of stress in the family that, as you said, out of guilt or whatever, that the family will say, eat, you have to eat. The question is whether there's a resource that a person could turn to in order to deal with family or clergy regarding the ethical correctness of the option or the decision to stop eating and drinking. I should mention that in the 200 responses that I received after my article was published, there were only 4 people that questioned the ethics or the morality of this decision, and they were all Catholic clergy. I think that that's a group that would be have particularly strong feelings about it. As far as a resource, there is an article by Thaddeus Mason Pope in our bibliography that was a tremendous resource for us on both medical, legal, and ethical, and he goes through the ethical analysis. But the ethical analysis that I have done and he does is more of an ethical analysis for the doctors, not so much the personal ethics. So, you know, other than the fact that it is a natural process, as you have described, I'm not sure it would be all that helpful. I think that some of the articles in Ellen Goodman's website, the Conversation Project, would address issues similar to this, and I think you could probably find something helpful there. Do you agree?
You know, dying's very personal. From the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you know, each religion, you know, you need to sort of think it through and find things that kind of make sense to you.
And that's why it's better to do it in advance of when the situation is facing you. Oh, the question was whether we had any experience in North Carolina with seeking the assistance of an ombudsman to help get a long-term care facility on board with this decision. And we have not, but I would like to say that one of the things we advise that is if you're thinking of entering a long-term care facility and you have this in mind of something that you would like to do in the future, to talk to them in advance, not when you're in the situation of dying, but when you're in the situation of moving in, and say, is this something that you would support? Now, we know for sure that Carol Woods supports this option. Whether they do it in the situation of dementia, I am not sure. But in all other circumstances, they support it. And I think there are other facilities that support it also. But you're best to find that out before you move in.
I'd like to thank the Schaefers very much for spending this time with us today.
We paid our dues all those years, and it's so nice to be switching gears. It's a grand new century, and it's the senior life, the senior life, the senior life for me.